You hear the crowd long before you can see the water. It is a bright, hard morning on the river Tagus, in Lisbon, in the year 1740, and you are standing on a stone quay with your back against a wall of warehouses, while what feels like the entire city tries to push past you toward the riverside. Because the fleet is in. Once a year, if the weather allows it and the privateers miss it, a convoy comes up out of the South Atlantic from Rio de Janeiro, and this morning the ships are lying at anchor out in the river with their yards squared, and the lighters are coming ashore one after another, and what is in the lighters is gold. Not gold as a turn of phrase. Gold in wooden chests with iron bands and royal seals stamped on the lids, so heavy that it takes 4 men to move one, and there are a great many of them, and they keep coming all morning, up the wet steps and into the customs house under armed guard while the crowd cranes to see. You are watching the largest quantity of gold any part of the world had ever pulled out of the ground being unloaded at the front door of one of the smaller, poorer kingdoms of Western Europe. Now stay exactly where you are, because here is the part I actually want you to see. Down at the far end of that same quay, tied up and ignored in all the excitement, there is a small, plain, fast little vessel flying English colors. She is a packet boat, and she runs to Falmouth in Cornwall. And within days, sometimes within hours, a very serious share of the gold that has just come up those steps will go quietly back down them again, in smaller boxes, and be carried aboard her, and she will sail north on the tide. Hold both pictures in your head at once. The chests coming in from Brazil in the sunshine, with the crowd and the priest and the trumpets and the seals, and the little English boat at the end of the quay taking it away again with no ceremony at all. That is this whole story in one morning on one stretch of stone. Brazil dug up more gold than the world had ever seen. Portugal was the address it was posted to, and Portugal is not where it stopped. Right. Let me move these papers out of the way, and let me put something on the table between us, because I would like you to look at it while I talk. There. A coin. It is not real before you get excited. It is a cheap souvenir copy I bought in a shop in Ouro Preto for roughly the price of a sandwich, and my wife thinks I am a ridiculous old man for keeping it on my desk. But the original of that little disc is a Portuguese gold piece from the middle of the 1700s, and the metal in it came out of a stream in the mountains of Minas Gerais. I keep the copy propped against my lamp because it reminds me of the only question here worth asking. Not where did the gold come from. Everybody knows where it came from. Where did it go? My name is Joaquim. I taught history in Brazilian classrooms for the better part of 40 years, and I will confess to you at the start that for most of those years I taught this particular chapter badly. Not dishonestly, badly, because I taught it the way it is written in the book. In Brazil, we call it the ciclo do ouro, the gold cycle, and in the textbook it sits neatly between the sugar chapter and the coffee chapter like courses at a dinner. A map with little pickaxes on it, a photograph of a Baroque church, a paragraph about the quinto, the royal fifth, a paragraph about Ouro Preto, and then the sentence I said out loud to teenagers, year after year, standing under a ceiling fan with chalk on my fingers. The gold of Minas Gerais enriched Portugal. 6 words, and they are not exactly a lie, which is what makes them worse than a lie. They are an answer shaped so that you stop asking the question. Because if the gold enriched Portugal, the story is finished, is it not? Brazil was robbed, Portugal got rich. The end, turn the page, coffee. So let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at where Portugal sits in the income tables of Western Europe? Today, or in 1800? Because for a country that supposedly swallowed the greatest gold strike in human history, Portugal has spent 3 centuries being one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. That is not an accident, and it is not bad luck. That is the story. Sit comfortably. It begins, as so much of Brazilian history does, with men walking into the interior for bad reasons. For most of the 1600s, Portuguese America was a coastline. Sugar in the northeast, a string of ports, and behind them an interior Lisbon barely knew and barely wanted. The men who went inland were the Bandeirantes, expedition men out of Sao Paulo, and I will not romanticize them, because in Brazil they are argued about furiously, and for good reason. They went to capture indigenous people to sell into slavery, and they went hoping to find metal, because the Spanish had found mountains of silver at Potosi a century earlier, and the Portuguese crown had been sick with envy ever since. For 150 years they found nothing worth the walking, and then, somewhere around 1693, 1695, in the streams that run down out of a range of hard, folded, iron-colored mountains several hundred kilometers inland from Rio de Janeiro, they found it. And the thing to understand about what they found is that it was easy. That is what made it so dangerous. This was alluvial gold. Gold the mountains had already broken up for you and washed down into the gravel of the riverbeds, sitting in the sand, waiting. You did not need a company or an engineer or a shaft. You needed a wooden pan, a batea, a strong back, and a stream. A man could kneel in cold water in the morning and be, by the standards of the life he had left, wealthy by the evening. Now imagine that news getting out. It got out the way news has always got out. Somebody came down the mule trail to the coast with dust in a leather bag and paid for something with it in public, and the coast emptied. Sugar planters left their mills. Priests left their parishes. Soldiers deserted. Then it crossed the ocean, and Portugal itself began to empty into the trail. The figures you will see are estimates, and I flag that clearly, because good numbers for the colonial period are hard to come by, and historians argue about all of them. But the estimate commonly given is on the order of 400,000 Portuguese crossing the Atlantic into that rush in the first half of the century, out of a kingdom of perhaps 2 million people. It was very likely the largest movement of Europeans across the Atlantic that had ever happened, and it happened so fast that the crown began restricting who was allowed to take ship, because the king was watching his own country walk out of the door toward a hill in the middle of South America. They gave the place a name that is the most matter-of-fact name in the whole of Brazilian geography, Minas Gerais, the general mines, and in the middle of it, up in the folds of those mountains, a camp turned into a settlement, and the settlement turned into something genuinely strange. It was raised to the status of a town in 1711 and given a name with no modesty in it at all, Vila Rica, rich town. Later it took the name of the ore that the streams around it gave up, gold with a dark iron skin on it that made it look almost black. Ouro Preto, black gold. It became the seat of the captaincy, and if you go there today, you will find one of the most beautiful towns in the Americas, steep cobbled streets and Baroque churches falling down the sides of a valley. In the middle of the 1700s, it was, by some accounts, the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. I want to be careful there, because you will see wildly different figures. Some sources say well over 100,000 people. Others put it nearer 80,000. The colonial censuses are not good enough to settle it, but the order of magnitude is not in dispute, and it is astonishing. In the 1750s, this town in the mountains of Brazil had more people in it than New York and Boston put together. And it was a town that produced nothing you can eat. That is the detail I always gave my students because it makes the thing physical. Everything had to come up the mule trails. Salt, flour, dried beef, cloth, iron, nails, paper. In the early years there were real famines in the richest place on earth, and men with gold dust in their pockets could not buy a chicken because there was no chicken. There was even a small war, in 1708 and 1709, between the Paulistas who had found the gold and the outsiders who poured in after them, fought over who got to stand in which stream. And on top of that a civilization grew quickly, the way things grow in hot houses. Churches went up everywhere, gilded inside with the gold coming out of the ground beneath them, and by the end of the century, a mixed-race sculptor whom Brazil calls Aleijadinho was carving prophets out of soapstone on a hillside in a way no European academy had taught him. The gold made art. Something real was made there, and it is still standing. But now we have to talk about who was in the water, because gold does not come out of a riverbed by itself. Somebody stands in that river. The mines of Minas Gerais were worked by enslaved Africans in enormous numbers, and the gold rush changed the shape of the Atlantic slave trade to feed itself. Ships that had been carrying people to the sugar coast of the Northeast were redirected south, into Rio, and the people aboard them were marched inland up the same mule trails that carried the salt and the flour. Brazil received more enslaved Africans than any other destination in the Americas, by a wide margin, and across the 18th century, a great share of them went to the mining country. The figure most often given for the mining region is on the order of 500,000 people, and as always that is an estimate historians argue over. The work itself I will describe plainly and then leave alone, because I do not believe in dwelling on suffering for effect. In the early phase it meant standing in cold, running water for the whole of the daylight, bent double, washing gravel in a wooden pan, in a mountain climate that is genuinely cold at night. Later, when the streams gave out, it meant galleries driven into the hillsides, in the dark, in the water, with no support and no air. There is a number that circulates about this, and I want to handle it honestly rather than dramatically. You will read that the useful working life of an enslaved person in the mines was reckoned at about 12 years. That figure comes out of contemporary accounting, out of the way owners talked about replacement, and historians debate what it measured and how far it generalizes. So I will not tell you it is a precisely measured lifespan. What I will tell you, because here the evidence does converge, is that mining labor in Minas Gerais was among the deadliest work anywhere in the Atlantic world. Everyone at the time knew it, and it was budgeted for. That is the part that stays with me. It was budgeted for, and I have to give you the other half, because complicated is usually truer. Gold is portable. Gold can be hidden. An enslaved person washing gravel had, unlike a person cutting cane, a narrow real chance of concealing something, and out of that came quota, an arrangement by which an enslaved person could buy their own freedom in installments. Minas ended the century with one of the largest free black populations in the Americas. Black lay brotherhoods, the Irmandades, built and paid for their own churches there. Quilombos, runaway communities, formed all through those mountains. So, the deadliest labor on the continent, and at the same time one of the few places in the Americas where a person could purchase a way out of it. Both are true, and I have never trusted anyone who tells it to you with only one of them. Now, the king, Because from the very first week the crown in Lisbon wanted its share, and the share was 1/5. The quinto, 20% of everything off the top for the king. And the entire administrative history of Minas Gerais for 100 years is the history of the crown trying to collect that fifth, and failing, and changing the method, and failing again. Because gold dust leaves no paper trail. It goes into a bag, the bag goes into a saddle, and the saddle goes down a mule trail through 800 kilometers of mountains where the crown has perhaps a dozen officials. Contraband was not a leak in this system. Contraband was the system, and everybody from the miner to the governor was somewhere inside it. So they tried everything. They taxed by the pan. They set fixed quotas. Then they built the thing people really hated. The casas de fundicao, the smelting houses. Here is how those worked. It becomes illegal to hold or spend raw gold dust at all. You must bring everything you take out of the ground to a royal smelting house where it is melted in front of you. The king's fifth is removed, and the rest is poured into a bar, stamped with the royal arms and handed back. Only stamped bars are legal money. Anything else in your pocket is a crime, and the punishments were severe. The house at Vila Rica was installed in 1720, and the town rose against it almost immediately. On the night of St. Peter, the 29th of June, 1720, a crowd came out in Vila Rica behind a muleteer and small farmer named Felipe dos Santos, demanding that the smelting houses be abolished. It lasted a few weeks. It was put down. Felipe dos Santos was executed and made an example of, and in the same year the crown carved Minas Gerais out of Sao Paulo and made it a captaincy of its own, so that it could be watched properly. Then they tried taxing people instead of metal. Between 1735 and 1750, there was a system called the capitacao, a head tax, so much gold per year for every enslaved worker you owned, whether that worker found anything or not. Think about the logic of that for a moment. The crown had given up on measuring the gold and started measuring the human beings. And then, in 1750, the arrangement that will eventually blow up in everybody's face. The quinto came back, but with a floor under it. Minas Gerais must deliver 100 arrobas of gold to the crown every year, about 1,500 kilos. And if the fifth collected in a given year did not reach that 100 arrobas, then the difference would be taken from the population at large, from everybody, minor or not, by force. That levy had a name, and if you know one Portuguese word from this period, it is probably this one. The derrama, the spilling. Hold on to it. We will come back to it at the end. Right. So the fifth is collected, the bars are stamped. The mule trains go down to Rio. The fleet crosses the Atlantic. And we are back where we started, on the quay in Lisbon with the crowd and the chests and the guards. The king receiving all this is Dom João V, who reigned from 1706 to 1750, and whom the Portuguese called the Magnificent, which in the circumstances is a very polite word for what he did with the money. He built. He built on a scale Portugal had no business building on. The palace and convent at Mafra, begun in 1717, is the monument. A basilica, a library, cells for hundreds of friars, put up by a workforce running into the tens of thousands. He bought a patriarchate for Lisbon from Rome. He bought jewels and carriages and music and a great deal of gilding. To be fair to the man, he also built the Aguas Livres aqueduct, which brought clean water into Lisbon and saved lives. So it was not all vanity. But notice that every item on that list is a thing you buy or a thing you commission. Nothing on it makes anything. And here is where I need you to stop thinking about kings, because kings are the small part of this. Underneath the palaces there is a duller and far more important fact about Portugal in the 1700s. Portugal did not make what Portugal used. It did not make cloth in any quantity, and cloth was the manufactured good of the age. It did not grow enough grain. It bought salt cod, hardware, iron goods, hats, glass, and nails. A country like that, when a river of money arrives, does not build a factory. It goes shopping, and the river runs straight through the country and out of the other side into whoever is holding the shop. So, who was holding the shop? This is the turn, my friend. This is the part they left out of my textbook and out of yours. In the year 1703, an English diplomat named John Methuen was in Lisbon negotiating, and he came away with treaties. The one everybody remembers is a very short commercial agreement signed in December of that year, only a few articles long, and read cold, it sounds almost boringly reasonable. England admits Portuguese wines at a duty lower than the one charged on French wine. Portugal admits English woolen cloth. Wine for cloth. That is essentially the whole thing, and it is why the English drink port, and why there is an English merchant quarter in the city of Porto to this day. On paper it looks balanced. It was not balanced, and it was not balanced for a reason that has nothing to do with the wording. England could choose to drink Portuguese wine or French wine or no wine at all. Portugal could not choose to stop needing cloth. One side of that bargain was a preference. The other side was a dependency. And now put the dates together, because this is the coincidence that decides the century. Methuen signs in 1703. The gold of Minas Gerais starts arriving in serious, world-altering quantity in precisely those same years. Nobody planned that. Neither government had any idea the strike was coming when they signed. But what it meant in practice was that Portugal now had a permanent, structural trade deficit with England, and an enormous new supply of the one commodity on earth that settles any debt anywhere without argument. Every year Portugal bought more from England than it sold to England. Every year the balance was paid in metal, and the metal came from Brazil. This was not hidden, and I want to be clear about that because it sounds like a conspiracy, and it was not one. It happened in daylight. There was an English merchant community in Lisbon and in Porto, organized and privileged, with its own factory house, which still stands. Packet boats ran regularly to Falmouth. British warships carried private gold as freight for a commission, quite openly. Contemporaries wrote about the traffic. English writers of the period boasted about it. The gold barely paused in Portugal. It landed, it settled a debt, and it went north. How much? Here is where I have to be honest with you rather than dramatic, because this is exactly the kind of number that gets repeated on the internet with a confidence that the sources do not support. The economic historian Nuno Palma, who works at the University of Manchester, and who has spent years in the Anglo-Portuguese trade and monetary records, puts England's share of Brazilian gold production across the 18th century at something like 2/3. On his numbers, the injection into England is on the order of £45 million sterling. In a period when the total gold circulating in England rose from around £9 million at the start of the century to around 26 million by 1780. Other historians looking at other windows and other records give considerably lower shares. You will also see a figure of about 30% for the years 1700 to 1760. Those are very different numbers, and I will not pretend I can settle a live argument between economic historians from an armchair. What I can tell you is what nobody in that argument disputes: the direction. Whether it was a third or two-thirds, the gold of Minas Gerais went to England, systematically, year after year, for the better part of a century, in quantities large enough to change the amount of money circulating in an entire national economy. And what does a very large quantity of new gold do to a country that has a Bank of England, a bond market, a shipping industry, an insurance trade, and a coal seam? It makes money cheap. It makes credit available. It makes a currency trusted, which is a large part of how Britain drifted onto a de facto gold standard in that century. It makes London, rather than Amsterdam, the place where Europe keeps its money. It does not build a single machine, but it fills the room in which machines get financed. And here I have to stop and put my hand up, because there is a sentence flying around out there that I am not going to say to you. The sentence is, Brazilian gold built the Industrial Revolution. I will not say it because it is not established, and you deserve better than a slogan. A serious historian will point out at once that Britain also had coal in the right places, and canals and coastal shipping to move it, a patent system, unusual labor costs that made machines worth building, a financial architecture a century in the assembling, and a whole Atlantic economy of sugar and slavery, and cotton feeding it from several directions. Gold on its own does not produce a spinning frame. Spain got mountains of silver and got no industrial revolution at all, which is the counterexample that should make anybody cautious. What can be said, and what serious people do argue, is narrower and more interesting. The Brazilian gold arrived in the specific country that had already built the financial plumbing to use it, and it arrived in the decades immediately before the takeoff, and it plausibly helped create the monetary and credit conditions in which that takeoff became affordable. That is a real claim. It is also an argued claim, not a settled one. And if I told you otherwise, I would be doing to you exactly what my textbook did to me. So let me give you the names and go and check me, which you should do with anybody who tells you history. Charles Boxer, an Englishman, wrote The Golden Age of Brazil in 1962, and it is still the doorway into this subject. Kenneth Maxwell wrote Conflicts and Conspiracies on Brazil and Portugal in the second half of the century in 1973. And for the money itself, for the actual flows, go to Nuno Palma and the work he has done with Davis Kedrowski, which carries the wonderful title The Cross of Gold. And that title tells you their conclusion, which is the part of this that genuinely rearranged my thinking. Their argument is that the gold was not a windfall for Portugal. It was a curse, not morally, economically, mechanically. A flood of easy metal pushed Portuguese production toward things you cannot export, made imported manufactures cheap and domestic ones pointless, hollowed out whatever industry was trying to be born, so that, when the gold ran out, and it did run out, Portugal had spent a century getting worse at making things. They put a figure on it, using a modeled comparison against countries that got no windfall. By the year 1800, Portuguese income per head was around 40% lower than it would have been if the gold had never been found. Now, that is a counterfactual, produced by a model, and reasonable people can and do argue with the method. I will not sell it to you as a measurement, but sit with the direction of it because it is extraordinary. Portugal may well have ended the greatest gold rush in the history of the world poorer than if it had never happened at all. And Brazil, by the 1780s, the streams were exhausted. The easy gold was gone, the galleries were flooding, output was falling year after year, and the towns of Minas were beginning the long slide into the beautiful, silent, gilded poverty that visitors find so photogenic today. But the quota did not fall. The crown still wanted its 100 arrobas. In 1788, a new governor arrived in Minas with instructions to collect the shortfall, and word went round the mountains that the derrama was coming. That fear, among other things, is what put a small circle of educated men in Vila Rica around a table talking about a republic, and you know how that ended, and if you do not, I have told that story properly on another evening and I will not squeeze it into a footnote. I only want you to notice the shape of it. The gold left. The tax stayed. The tax outlived the thing it taxed. What Brazil kept in the end was churches, towns, a shifted center of gravity, and a wound. The gold is why the colonial capital moved from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro in 1763, because Rio was the port that served the mines, and that is a large part of why Rio and the Southeast are what they are today. So it was not nothing, but it was not a school or a bank or a workshop or a single machine that made another machine. Now let me tell you about Renato, because a boy in my class asked the question that made me go back and learn all this properly. He was about 15, he was bored, he had his chin on his hand, and he asked it in the flat, unimpressed way that only a teenager can. "Professor," he said, "if we sent them all that gold, why are we poor and they are rich?" And I gave him the lazy answer. I said, "Well, Renato, because they took it. Because the colonial system was extraction and the wealth went to Europe, and that is why." And he shrugged and I moved on, and it bothered me for about a week, and then I understood why it bothered me. My answer was wrong. Not politically wrong, factually wrong. Because who is they? If the answer to Renato's question is Portugal, then Portugal should be rich, and Portugal is not and has not been for 300 years. The gold went through Portugal like water through a sieve. Portugal held the greatest treasure in the world for a century and came out the other side of it poor. And Brazil dug it and came out the other side of it poor. And there were an awful lot of dead people in the mountains in between. So who got rich? The people who sold things. That is the whole answer. Not the people who found the gold, not the people who dug the gold, not the king whose seal was stamped on the bars. The people who had cloth to sell and ships to carry it, and a bank to keep the account in, and a treaty that guaranteed the door would stay open. And that, my friend, is the part I want to hand to you, because it is not a Brazilian lesson, and it is not an 18th century lesson. It is the oldest and least comfortable rule in economics, and every generation gets to learn it again the hard way. Owning the thing everybody wants is not the same as owning an economy. Sometimes it is the opposite, because when the money is easy, nobody builds anything difficult. Why fund a workshop and train people and lose money for 10 years when you can simply dig and sell and buy the finished article from whoever bothered to build the workshop? And then the seam runs out, and you have the churches and the palaces and not one skill you did not have before. So here is my homework, and I promise it is easy. Think about wherever you live, not its history, its shipping. What does it dig up or grow or pump? And then ask the second question, the one nobody asks. What does it buy back? Because the gap between those two lists is exactly where the money is made, and it is almost never made by whoever is holding the shovel. The names change. Cloth becomes machinery, becomes chips, becomes whatever comes next. The shape does not change. There is always a Lisbon, and there is always a small, fast boat at the end of the quay. I would genuinely like to hear from you on this one, and I have 2 questions, so take them one at a time. First, the simple one. Before tonight, had anybody ever told you where the Brazilian gold actually ended up? Not that it was taken. Where it went afterwards. I suspect this is taught almost nowhere, and I would like to be proved wrong. And second, the one I actually care about. Tell me the thing your own country digs up or grows or pumps out of the ground, and then tell me who you think ends up with the money from it. One line. Your country, your commodity, your answer. I want to read 100 of those stacked in the comments, from a dozen countries, because when you see them in a column, you will notice they are all telling the same story with different nouns. And if this was worth an evening of your time, do an old teacher a kindness and subscribe, because the history of my country is full of enormous things that were shrunk to 6 words by the people who wrote the summary, and I intend to keep opening them back up, 1 warm hour at a time, for as long as you will sit here with me. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for staying to the end of a long one, and the next time you read that the gold cycle enriched Portugal, I want you to see that Quay again. The chests coming up the wet steps in the sunshine with the crowd and the trumpets and the royal seals. And then look past all of it, down to the far end, at the little English boat that nobody is watching, sitting quietly at her mooring, waiting for the tide.